Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty for July 31st, 2019. This is, I guess, our one-year anniversary. We started this show back on July 30th of 2018. So thank you so much for those of you, whether you've been with us for a day or a year or part of it. I'm so grateful to be able to do this program with you. My name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We broadcast live through our channels at YouTube, Periscope, Facebook, Twitch.tv, and DLive. We also have archived video versions over at BitChute, which is a good platform, and Brighteon.com. We originally were putting all of our archives over at Brighteon, but they were running into some bandwidth issues and have done an upgrade. And Mike Adams, the guy who runs naturalnews.com, really is dedicated to protecting freedom of speech or the ability of people to be able to post things that may not be popular on his platform. So we know that he is not on board with the idea of deplatforming people and building Brighteon to be able to work. So we are back posting all of our episodes over at Brighteon.com. Of course, we have all of our archives in a podcast version, at least. We didn't do it for the first month or so of the show because I wasn't expecting to be able to do that, but all of the archives now also go on podcasts at iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google, and elsewhere. And you can find all of this stuff over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Today we're talking about corruption. And I'm just going to touch briefly what actually got me thinking about this yesterday. And I try to avoid some of the day-to-day soap opera, the outrage of the day or the week, where everyone is distracted about the fighting amongst the different parties and personalities about one issue or another, while they both are working to expand federal power at almost every single turn, spending more money, invading our rights, usurping power all the time. But the latest one is Baltimore. This Representative Elijah Cummings, I believe his name is, and Donald Trump and Ben Carson, all these people are fighting back and forth about the state of Baltimore. And I think almost everyone, even where they get something right, and I'm not going to get into the details of this, but I want to focus on a foundational principle that even when they're right, and there was a tweet from the president where I think he was right about something, but it's still missing the big picture, the big important picture. So I'm going to start out with that tweet that I saw yesterday. And maybe it wasn't a tweet, it was a statement, and then I saw a tweet from The Hill that was a video of his statement about Baltimore. So I'm going to start out with that. Then I want to cover some warnings from the founders. Madison, Jefferson, there's also Fisher Ames from the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention. Then I want to talk about, what we can call a block and pivot, talk about how what they're saying about Baltimore is actually applicable to other things, like the Pentagon, for example. And then, of course, I want to wrap up with some additional thoughts from the founders. Hopefully I can get to all that before doing it. I do want to say hi to everyone out in the live chat, those of you who are joining me here right now over on YouTube. There's Justin Bayola, Anna Reyes, Tyler B., Heather Rossi, good to see you. Ward Lawrence as well, EHP Training, and Alan Mosley with the Gold Standard. Over on Facebook, Shane Lackey, Little Bear, Barry Scott, Clay Bowler, Dennis Marburger, Dan Reed, and Don Frya. Good to see you. Jeff Johnson, Steve Ivins, Justin Morrison, Andrew Nappy, everybody else. I apologize for anybody who I may be missing. I will look back here in the chat to see if there's any interesting questions or comments as we go through the show, probably a little bit later on the show. So I appreciate you guys who are leaving some comments. I'll check on that later in the show, and then also after I'm done broadcasting, I generally pop in and reply to some comments as I'm able to. So let's get into this. I guess I should pull up this tweet. Yesterday, it's a tweet from The Hill with a video of President Donald Trump talking about Baltimore. And he says specifically, the government has pumped in over the years billions and billions of dollars to no avail. To absolutely no avail. Baltimore is an example of what corrupt government leads to. And I know a lot of people who hate the president immediately say, well, he's a racist. because he's calling out this city as being in a bad place, and maybe it is. I haven't been to Baltimore in a long, long time. My sister used to live there some years ago, and I'm sure, like any city, like I live here in Los Angeles, and I know people are always writing to me saying, how are the tents doing? Thinking that the city is overrun by homelessness. I mean, it certainly is a big problem, but there are a lot of areas in big cities that are really bad, and then there are other areas where you don't even see it at all. So I live in kind of a quasi area that you get a little bit of both. Or you have easy access to a little of both. So I'm sure Baltimore, like so many others, San Francisco and elsewhere, has some good parts and has some bad parts. But certainly, I think the president is absolutely correct. You could apply this to basically any city or any government. When you pump a lot of money into something, you aren't going to get what they promised you. It just doesn't happen. And in fact, you could probably say that the more the government funds opposition to something, the more that you get what they were supposedly trying to prevent. So the war on poverty gives you more poverty. War on drugs gives you more drugs and killing. And the war on privacy, well, that's what they do all the time. The war on terror, we've seen some research recently that since the launch of AFRICOM, the terrorist presence in Africa has actually gone up instead of being brought down. Maybe it's gone up less quickly. I don't know. But I think it's a pretty universal maxim that when the government goes after something, they either have lied to you about what they're doing, or it's going to cost way more to get anything done. I mean, you can successfully buy a Toyota Corolla, but if the government does it, it'll probably cost you $250,000. So I think there's a lot of truth in what Donald Trump is saying here. Baltimore is an example of what corrupt government. You could probably remove the word corrupt in almost every situation, because what happens, and I think he gets cause and effect wrong here. What happens is when you're pumping billions and billions of dollars into something and you create centralized power structures, either in a small geographic area or in a large one, what you end up with is corruption. The fact that government is involved in so much stuff is what causes the corruption in the first place. It wasn't corrupt. Well, maybe it was, but what causes an outgrowth or an increase, a rapid increase in corruption, is the fact that there's so much money. Now, it would be interesting to see how much federal funding goes into Baltimore, because if it's anything like Los Angeles, even on a smaller scale, there is a ton of federal money that comes in, whether through grant programs, task force partnerships, enforcement of all kinds of federal programs and regulations, asset forfeiture, the equitable sharing program. So the feds also turn local cities into these really kind of bad areas sometimes, because I think the feds screw everything up. And then, of course, the local politicians love it. Anyways, short version, the pumping of the billions and billions of dollars is what creates a situation where it is absolutely going to be corrupt. And I wanted to talk a little bit about corruption. Oh, and as a side note, I pulled this up. It is not just the local government in Baltimore that has always been problematic. If you have followed some of our work here at the 10th Amendment Center, you may realize, or you may be aware, that we have this campaign that we are still working on to this day to turn off resources to federal surveillance programs. We've had bills passed here in California, a moderate one and a really good one in Michigan, and working on some in other areas as well. But the reason for that is because of Fort Meade, Maryland. The NSA back in 2006, it was reported in the Baltimore Sun, had maxed out the Baltimore area power grid. They were concerned that it was going to shut down the entire agency because government, of course, the corrupt government, the more power it has, the more things it does, the more corrupt it's going to be. It's just going to use and use and use. So whether it's using money for bureaucracy or using power to spy on everybody, always some bad things that happen out of it. I just wanted to make that point as a quick aside here. Now, we're talking about power. Power is a problem, or corruption comes from power and what the founders called consolidation. So when you centralize things and you make decision-making go into hands of individuals or small groups of people or come from one area, then you run into a lot of problems. We had a lot of warnings about power, corruption, usurpation, consolidation, and the like. And here from James Madison, he put it this way: The essence of government is power. The essence of what government is force. And for those of you who are libertarians or ANCAPs who watch the show, you recognize that all government actions, at the end of it, is the barrel of a gun. Because if you don't follow what government does, government may decide to pull out guns and force you to, or throw you in a cage and lock you up if you don't comply with it. Now, they generally don't have the manpower to do that. But the threat, the act of government, is that threat. So that's what Madison recognized as well. He used different language than I think the ANCAPs of today use. He says the essence of government is power. And power, lodged as it must be in human hands, will ever be liable to abuse. So he recognized this universal truth that government can only exist through the use of power and force. And because humans are wielding that power, it is always liable to be abused. And that was one of the reasons that, I think that was probably the reason that the founders wanted to limit the amount of power that any political entity would have, because they recognize that as soon as you have a lot of power, it's going to go in a bad way. Of course, that's the old Lord Acton saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I know a lot of people focus on the last part of that, like, oh, when they have a ton of power, it's really, really bad. But all power has a corrupting influence, all of it. Here's Fisher Ames in the Massachusetts Ratification Convention, and he referred to this same thing. And I'm not sure if you can read this if you're watching, because the text is pretty small here through Google Books. All the links are in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty, all spelled out. I publish those generally 30 minutes to an hour after I'm done doing the live broadcast. So Fisher said this way: a consolidation of the states, so centralization of power, would subvert the Constitution. Too much provision cannot be made against consolidation. So he felt that you couldn't ever err in going too far to prevent centralization of power, because centralization of power was such a great danger. They literally fought a revolution to secede from a centralized power structure that was the British Empire. So they didn't want to repeat that. Here's how Thomas Jefferson put it in a letter to Gideon Granger on August 13, 1800. Again, repeating the same warning, the same concern about consolidation and centralization of power. Our country is too large to have all its affairs directed by a single government. Public servants at such a distance and from under the eye of their constituents will, from the circumstance of distance, be unable to administer and overlook all the details necessary for the good government of the citizen. And I think when you talk about the federal government funding state and local programs, this certainly applies. It creates a distortion in the marketplace. They fund certain programs that crowd out, whether it's private charity, private education, whatever it may be, private business, and they drive the money to that they've stolen from people through taxation, and they create these programs, and then you build bureaucracies and corruption on the local level as well. And he goes on, Jefferson goes on to Granger, and the same circumstance, by rendering detection impossible to their constituents, will invite the public agents to corruption, plunder, and waste. Corruption, plunder, and waste. So when you centralize power, and I think you could apply this to any level of government on any issue, when you centralize power, you consolidate power in the hands of the few, and you don't have competition. So even if it's a small area and government has taken control, created a monopoly on something, a government-backed monopoly or a government-run monopoly, without competition, crowding out market participants, or the choice in being able to fund it or not, then you invite the public agents, as Jefferson put it, to corruption, plunder, and waste. So when Trump says Baltimore is an example of what corrupt government leads to, he's part right, but he's also part wrong. Baltimore is an example of what government leads to, or centralization of power leads to, in my view. And he said, if you were to actually continue the consolidation until you basically had one central point, and this is just a kind of an addendum to this, He was so concerned about consolidation and centralized power that he thought even after the revolution, even after the Articles, even after creating the Constitution, even with him as president, if you centralized all power, it would, quote, become the most corrupt government on the face of the earth. And I think that would be something to look at some point here, what's happening today. And of course, I always point out James Madison. I said this in our last show. James Madison's warning about the three greatest dangers to liberty. And I will say this over and over again. It cannot be repeated often enough. This was from his paper, Political Observations in 1795. And he says this, quote, "Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few." We know that war, and he went on to talk about how in a state of war, the discretionary power, the power of the executive, so more centralization of power is expanded. This is just something that has always happened in history, at least up until that point. I think if one were to do a study from 1795 to 2019, you'd find the same thing. There's always an excuse for more executive power. Here in the U.S., the argument has been called the unitary executive theory, the idea that under Article 2 of the Constitution, the executive can do basically whatever they want. So when we're talking about power, consolidation, and corruption, we can understand that a military state, a militarized country, whether it's police or an actual standing army, is very dangerous. It leads to that centralization. It leads to the corruption. It leads to the debt and taxes that destroy our liberty. And so if you take what Trump said about Baltimore, this is an example of what corrupt government leads to, and you switch that around, funding things over and over and creating centralized power structures lead to corruption. And then you ignore the fact that Donald Trump and his friends in the Republican and Democrat parties are doing the same thing in Washington, D.C. Like they're attacking. What's the old saying about throwing stones? Don't throw stones until you've cleaned your own house. I don't know how the saying goes. Maybe someone could tell me in the live chat. But basically, he's telling an almost truth about Baltimore, about corruption, about government spending, while at the same time pushing for the exact same thing on a federal level. Now, if Baltimore were corrupt and horrible, at least the idea, the notion that Baltimore is corrupt, it's a lot easier to escape Baltimore, go to Annapolis, go to Boise, Idaho, I don't know, wherever you want to go, Racine, Wisconsin. You can get out of there much easier. But in this, in the status quo, when you have centralized power structures and a ton of funding on a national level that leads to corruption, plunder, and waste, then there's not really much of an escape hatch, or it becomes extremely difficult. So there's a lot of hypocrisy that's happening here, pointing there, but not, the finger isn't pointing back. And we know that last month, late June, the Senate passed one of the largest defense authorization bills in history, $750 billion for 2020. It was an 86-8 vote. And here from Defense News, it says it all but erased a week of uncertainty surrounding the must-pass policy measure, which has passed Congress for more than 5 consecutive decades. In other words, it never fails to pass. They always continue to fund, and they almost always ramp up the amount of funding. $750 billion. That's a lot of money. And now the House passed another version that ramps it up even another level. This was the deal that was made between Nancy Pelosi and Steve Mnuchin in the White House. Under this deal, according to Common Dreams, the Pentagon and its affiliate programs will get $1.48 trillion over the next 2 years. The entire rest of the government, including the VA, by the way, will get 1.3 trillion. That's 178.6 billion without just glossing over the numbers. In other words, it is a lot of money that is being poured, billions and billions of dollars. And if anyone thinks that Washington, D.C., especially supporters of the president, we're talking about this is a guy that ran on draining the swamp. So clearly everyone's talking about Washington, D.C. as being corrupt. So if Washington, D.C. is corrupt, the solution to a corrupt government isn't to give it more money to spend on. It doesn't matter who's in charge. The government is corrupt, and your new team who's in there aren't going to be there forever. Even if you think everything that they do is correct, this is a dangerous approach because one only needs to watch the Democrat debates to see what they're going to do with all kinds of new power and new funding. And if this becomes the new floor that you always spend $1.5 trillion or $3 trillion on everything, you're going to have real problems in the future that get worse and worse and worse. Not that there aren't real problems right now. Oh, I skipped ahead here. So I do want to cover the fact for people who say, okay, well, you got to rebuild the military, right? We're always sold on this message that the military is being destroyed, it's depleted, and it needs to be restored, right? This is total propaganda, in my view. They aren't spending money on national defense. There's militarism spending. This is empire. And one only needs to be able to compare the amount of spending with the rest of the world to be able to see what's really happening. And this is only for 2018. At the time, the U.S. was spending about $100 billion less per year. In 2018, the U.S. spent $650 billion. At the same time, Germany, the UK, Russia, France, India, Saudi Arabia, and China combined spent $40 billion less. So the U.S. is supposedly depleted. We're supposedly having to rebuild our military. But yet, the country is spending more than the next 7 countries combined, and then the following 144 countries. So it's a pretty insane amount. And if they're getting close to $1 trillion a year, we're at $750 trillion, it's getting close to the rest of the world combined. I think there is a foreseeable future where if this is not stopped on this trajectory, it will be a time where the U.S. basically spends more than 50% of the world's budget on military. Currently, it's like 35, 36%, so about a third. But that's a ton of money. And this report from National Priorities says both of these numbers are stark increases from last year's differences. So 2018 to 2017, now it's higher for 2019, and now they're going to push it even higher for 2020. It just keeps going up and up and up. And they point out that we're running 800 military bases in 80 different countries. If the ratification conventions were presented with a plan for a constitution in 1787, 1788, and they were debating a plan where there would be a military installation built for the new United States government, Constitution for the United States, that new government. If they were presented with a plan where they would be basing military to do operations or protect us in 80 different countries or one different country, I think it would have been rejected everywhere. It was a close vote. I mean, it ended up passing. There were 10 states that ratified. North Carolina, for example, didn't for a while. Same with Rhode Island. They eventually did. But I don't think in a lot of the closer votes, places like New York, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Virginia, I don't think like in Massachusetts, you wouldn't have had John Hancock and Samuel Adams convincing the opposition to say, you know what, we're not talking about a consolidated, we're not talking about an empire here, we're not talking about this, we're going to have a limited set of delegated powers with powers reserved to the states. And they talked about that. Patrick Henry probably would have convinced the opposition to shoot it down in Virginia. No one would have approved this. But this is what it has become. Now, for those of you who want to blame the Constitution itself, I do plan on doing an episode on Spooner at some point in the future. But I think it is absolutely absurd to claim that the military needs to be rebuilt. Now, maybe part of it, I don't know, maybe there's old tanks that need to be thrown out. I don't know. Maybe there are parts. But certainly when you're spending more than all of your major so-called opponents combined. I mean, Russia is the great concern of so many people these days. So is China. The U.S. is probably triple what China is spending, and it's got to be 10 times or more than what Russia spends. This country could wipe out the face of the earth with a push of a handful of buttons, maybe one. To me, there's no rebuilding happening. This is expansion. And we were warned. Madison warned us. He said armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for the few to dominate the many. And this is what it's all about. And this is the hypocrisy, and I think where everyone's wrong. I know when I was a kid and I had an argument with my brother, my mother would come in and say, well, you're both wrong. Or maybe my dad said that more than my mom. But in this situation, I think a lot of the people arguing against Trump are wrong on the one hand. And Trump, while even where he's right, talking about the problem of spending billions, is wrong in not pointing out or doing the same thing in Washington, D.C. on a much larger scale. Now, of course, the founders warned us repeatedly about the danger of standing armies. And I did an entire episode on this as well back in May, why the founders wanted you to own military-style weapons. It was because they opposed standing armies that they felt that the militia should be strong. They felt that standing armies were so dangerous to liberty, large military complexes, what Eisenhower would have called the military-industrial complex. They knew this was totally dangerous. Even if the army wasn't going to go shoot a bunch of people, it would lead to debt and taxes. And debt and taxes is one of the three, one of the trifecta that leads to dominating the many by the few. So they thought that the excuse to require a large military complex, that you don't need it if everyone owns military-style weapons and trains themselves in how to use it. You really don't need it. You only would have to call forth the military in times or raise an army in certain times. But when at peace, now, of course, there's an argument to be made that if you're always engaged in war, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But anyways, that was a very interesting episode back on May 20th. The link will be in the show notes as well. This article from Joe Wolverton last year, my buddy who writes over at newamerican.com through the John Birch Society, and then he also does a number of articles for us as well. He put a lot of quotes on here talking about how a large standing army, or a standing army of any size, depending on the founder. Some refer to large ones, some refer to any. Recognized how dangerous to liberty it would be. Not always that they were going to shoot us all down, but because of the other effects of having to fund it. Here's George Mason. No man has a greater regard for the military gentlemen than I have. I admire their intrepidity, perseverance, and valor. But when once a standing army is established in any country, the people lose their liberty. I'm going to skip over Alexander Hamilton in this article because even when Hamilton's good, he was awful. Well, just untrustworthy. Here's St. George Tucker, who in 1803 wrote the first total systematic law review of the Constitution. He was highly respected by the founding generations. He said, quote, "Wherever standing armies are kept up and the right of the people to keep and bear arms is under any color or pretext whatsoever prohibited, liberty, if not already annihilated, is on the brink of destruction." We certainly are 2 for 2. There is a standing army, a huge one, larger than the next 7 countries combined, larger than the following 144 countries, at least if you go by spending. And then, of course, the right to keep and bear arms is often, and in most situations, only a privilege. It is not a right because it's still a right, but people use it as a privilege. They basically wait to get permission from government before they keep and bear arms. And even in places where there are fewer restrictions in the states, people are still following federal restrictions from 1934, 68, 86, and beyond that restrict our natural right to defend ourselves, and even have military-style weapons as well to prevent the need for having a standing army. And so we were warned over and over and over. And of course, George Washington's famous farewell address. He says, "They will avoid the necessity of those overgrown military establishments, which, under any form of government, are inauspicious to liberty, and which are to be regarded as particularly hostile to Republican liberty." Here's the general. In fact, They kept referring to, he was so respected as General Washington. They often referred to him as the General or General Washington rather than President Washington, because this is a military man. This is a guy who's a military man who is, like Eisenhower, warning of military establishments. And he says they are particularly hostile to Republican liberty. So while Trump is correct in pointing the finger at the corruption and the billions being spent in Baltimore, he is advocating for billions and hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars to be spent on the military-industrial complex, something that the founders warned us would be particularly hostile to Republican liberty. So, surprise, surprise, you won't hear this kind of thing. You won't hear this kind of talk from either the Democrats or the Republicans. And they might oppose spending. So some Democrats, some progressives might oppose the massive military budget. But at the same time, they support tons of domestic spending, funding all kinds of programs in Baltimore and everywhere else. And in vice versa. You'll hear Republicans, like the president, oppose the funding, the waste, the corruption and plunder that is happening on a state or a local level or on various welfare programs. But at the same time, they advocate the massive bloated military budgets. You don't hear them really ever opposing all of it. Because when you oppose all of it, you're then opposing the programs that they like as well. And so then they ignore the real problem, the centralization of power. As long as there is a ton of power in any level of government, and I generally focus on Washington, D.C., as long as there's tons of power, there's going to be a lot of money thrown at it. There's going to be a lot of lobbying. There's going to be a lot of legislation. There's going to be a lot of attacks on your liberty. There's going to be armies and debts and taxes, the known elements for putting the many under the domination of the few. So I hope you guys are finding this interesting. I want to check over in the live chat and see what's going on over here. Oh, man, there's a lot. Little Bear Barry Scott. Would you hate someone that told you that you need to run your country this way, the same as ways we do, but you want to run your country your way? That's what our government is doing. Absolutely. And I think that's what politicians in general do, is they tell people, I mean, the idea of keeping things decentralized is that when you have these politicians telling people how to run their country, it's the geographical area that they're screwing up or maybe doing a great job, which is pretty rare. Let's say it happens. You get programs that you like and you think it's amazing. They're limited to a small geographic area. And the more that you have this type of thing happening, the more that each area you can have this market type competition where people can actually learn what's good and bad. Ward Lawrence says, doesn't the Constitution say for the federal government to provide a Navy? Yes, certainly. But I think the point is let's say they're funding Army, Navy, Air Force, all that, without having whatever debate may come up about that. The notion that there has to be 800 some odd military bases or outposts in 80 countries is not something that any of the founders would have been in favor of. None of them. The Constitution wouldn't exist at all. This just wouldn't happen. They would have stayed part of the British Empire if that's what they wanted. They did not. They fought against this type of thing. Luke Pora says, we have 5.56 rifles. I think it's okay to let police have the same. U.S. attack Russia. Little Bear says, Russia said they would no longer have the money. Interesting. Nappy says, if we don't fight them over there, we'll fight them over here. Plus, they hate us for our freedoms. And freedom isn't free. Did I leave anything out? No, I think you got most of them. And of course, all of this military power, all the surveillance, all the programs, the gun control, all of this will only just be to stop the terrorist and protect people. And of course, it ends up being used on everyone else. Guy Boxman, or is it Buxman? People obsess about the evil of banks and corporations, but those couldn't wreak their havoc without the complicity of the state, which makes them look like small-time purse snatchers by comparison. Certainly. The corporations are creations of the state. They go get approval of the state. But let's say Walmart wants to force me to pay for a military empire. Well, Walmart can't come to my house and say, well, you didn't fill out this form and sign it and send us $5,000 this year. Walmart can't force me to do that. It is government that's ripping us all off. And when corporations, maybe government politicians, they like the money that come from corporate backers, so they're going to scratch backs back and forth. But when it comes down to the essence of government being power, like James Madison told us, the essence of government is power. The power is the force of the gun, not lobbying by corporations, which can be bad. Ward Lawrence, okay, this was my quote. Let he who is without sin be the first to cast a stone. That's what I was trying to get to. Michael Takash, it always amazes me here in the U.S. Our government-controlled schools do not include U.S. constitutional studies. Why? When covering reasoning and ethics, a good source, ethics is not too covered in government schools. Well, they don't like teaching about the Constitution, at least as the founders gave it to us, because it would basically limit government power. It would end, for example, federal funding of the government school system, for example. David Chilton says you can run from corruption, but unless you stand and fight, it'll catch up to you or your children or their children. P.S. I reside in Baltimore City, and I'm sure Baltimore, just like Los Angeles, is extremely corrupt. And just like Washington, D.C., drain the swamp is the message that we've been told for a few years now. That's because it is a swamp filled with corrupt creatures that should actually have real jobs. Dennis Marburger, the NDAA, that's the National Defense Authorization Act. So many problems, so many little time. The indefinite detention provisions still stand, of course. And they've passed this so-called legislation, these spending bills that are now up to $750 billion a year, every single year for about 5 decades. Power of the purse is Heather Rossi. Okay. There's a lot of interesting comments back and forth. And for those of you who are listening to the podcast, I apologize if I'm just kind of reading and going through this, but I'm very, very grateful for all the feedback that you guys are leaving in the comments, whether it's on Facebook, YouTube, or elsewhere. Please continue to do so. If you've got some thoughts about the show, I'm curious what you have to say, or if you've got some suggestions, continue to leave comments either right now live or later on in the archive. Of course, you can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Make sure to smash the like, subscribe, get notifications. If you support the show, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members is where you can support us for as little as $2 a month. We make it go a long, long way. I'm very grateful for everyone joining me today. I hope you found this interesting and educational. We'll see you Friday and, of course, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday here on the Path to Liberty. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Thanks for watching or listening, and have an awesome day.